The sign on the door said adoption hours. But inside, the lights were already off. It was a Tuesday. They weren't even supposed to be closed. A woman named Carla stood in the parking lot holding a leash attached to a dog no one had bothered to name. A skinny, flinching animal with a bite history that had made him unadoptable by every official metric the shelter used. She had 48 hours before that dog was scheduled to die. And she had no plan. What she did next didn't just save one dog. It rewired an entire community from the inside out. There's a version of this story you've probably heard before. Someone rescues a dog. The dog is transformed. Everyone cries, roll credits. But that's not what happened here. What happened here was messier, slower, and more uncomfortable than any feel-good headline could capture. Because this wasn't just about one dog surviving. It was about an entire town confronting what it had quietly agreed to ignore for years. A shelter system running a 90% kill rate. A community that called itself dog-friendly while looking the other way. And one ordinary woman, who accidentally became the pressure point for all of it. Not because she was extraordinary, because she simply refused to accept the answer she was given. If you've ever felt powerless watching a broken system grind forward, if you've ever adopted a dog who everyone else had already given up on, or if you've ever wondered whether one person can actually move something as heavy as institutional failure, this story is for you. We're going to walk through exactly what happened, why it worked, and what it quietly teaches us about the gap between what communities say they value and what they actually do. Stay with me, because the part that will stay with you longest isn't the rescue. It's what came after. Let us go back to that parking lot. Carla wasn't an activist. She wasn't a dog trainer or a shelter reform advocate. She was a 38-year-old logistics coordinator who had recently gone through a divorce and had, on what she later described as a particularly bad Friday afternoon, walked into that shelter just to look around. She left with nothing that day, but she remembered one dog. He was in the back row, not the cute front-facing kennels near the entrance where the adoptable dogs wagged and pressed their noses through the chain link. He was in the overflow section, the part most visitors never see. He had a red tag on his kennel door. In that shelter system, red meant final notice. She didn't adopt him that day. She went home, slept on it, and came back Monday morning. By Monday, his paperwork had already been processed for euthanasia. She had 48 hours, and she had to sign a behavioral waiver acknowledging that this dog had snapped at a staff member and was considered a liability. She signed it. She named him Freight, and she took him home to a one-bedroom apartment with a no-pets policy. Here's what most people do not understand about dogs who come from high-stress shelter environments, especially those flagged for behavioral issues. The behavior you see in that kennel is almost never the behavior you get in a stable home. Shelters, even well-intentioned ones, are neurologically overwhelming environments. The noise, the unpredictability, the rotating staff, the smell of fear, it triggers a sustained stress response that makes dogs appear aggressive, shut down, or erratic. Freight had been in that system for 4 months. 4 months of fluorescent lights, chain-link walls, and strangers. What looked like a bite risk was a trauma response. Carla didn't know the science behind this at the time. She just knew the dog she saw when she got him home was different from the dog she'd been warned about. Within 3 weeks, Freight was sleeping at the foot of her bed. Within 6, he was greeting her neighbors in the hallway. But here's where the story shifts, because Carla started talking about him. Not in a performative way, just the way people talk when something genuinely surprises them. She mentioned him at work. She posted a few unpolished photos on a neighborhood forum, and something unexpected happened. People started asking questions, not just what a cute dog questions, real ones. Questions like, wait, that shelter has a 90% kill rate, and why didn't I know that? And is that even legal? Carla didn't have all the answers, but she started finding them. She submitted a public records request for the shelter's annual statistics, something that is entirely within public right in most jurisdictions, but that almost no ordinary resident ever does. What she got back was staggering. Over the previous 3 years, That shelter had euthanized an average of 840 animals per year. Of those, internal notes classified over 60% as space and resource euthanasia, meaning the animals weren't critically ill or dangerously aggressive. They were killed because the shelter was full. And the shelter was full in part because the municipality hadn't increased its operational budget in 11 years. She printed the numbers. She brought them to a city council meeting. Not with a speech prepared, she genuinely didn't know how these things worked. She just asked a question during public comment. "Can someone explain this to me?" And then she read the numbers out loud. The room was uncomfortable. No one had a clean answer. But the local paper was there, and a journalist named Priya picked up the story the next morning. That's when the pressure began to build. But here's the thing about systemic pressure. It doesn't move in a straight line. What followed wasn't a dramatic overnight turnaround. It was 18 months of incremental friction, small wins, frustrating setbacks, and a community slowly waking up to itself. And freight was at the center of every single public conversation about it. Not because anyone planned that, but because people needed a face, a story, a before and after they could hold on to. Carla started bringing him to community events. People would crouch down to pet him, and she'd tell them where he came from. By month 4, she had been contacted by 11 other residents who had either pulled dogs from that same shelter or lost dogs to the system before they could act. They started meeting informally, first in Carla's apartment, then in a borrowed conference room at the public library. What they built was not a nonprofit. Not yet. It was a network, a volunteer coordination system, specifically designed to do the thing the shelter structurally couldn't do on its own. Get dogs out faster, into foster homes, before the red tag went on the door. They called themselves the Freight Network. They weren't competing with the shelter. They were plugging gaps the shelter didn't have the staffing to address. And critically, they brought data. Every dog they pulled, every outcome they tracked, went into a shared spreadsheet that grew into a reporting document they presented to the shelter's oversight board 6 months in. The shelter director, a man named Dale who had held the position for 9 years, initially pushed back. Hard. His concern wasn't unfounded. Volunteer networks operating without formal liability structures can create real problems for municipal shelters. But the Freight Network had anticipated this. They'd consulted with a local attorney who specialized in nonprofit compliance, brought in a certified animal behaviorist to establish intake protocols, and drafted a formal partnership proposal that protected the shelter legally while expanding its capacity. Dale didn't love it, but he signed it, because the alternative was increasingly public scrutiny, and he was a practical man. By month 10, the foster network had grown to 47 active volunteers. The shelter's live release rate, the percentage of animals who left alive, had climbed from 11% to 38%. That's not a miracle. That's logistics. That's what happens when you reduce bottlenecks, increase placement pathways, and build in behavioral assessment earlier in the intake process, so dogs aren't sitting in kennels long enough to develop the kind of institutional stress that makes them unadoptable. But here is what surprised even Carla. The impact wasn't only on the shelter, it was on the community's identity. Local businesses started sponsoring adoption events. A veterinary clinic offered discounted wellness exams for foster dogs. The high school's junior STEM program built an automated scheduling tool for volunteer coordination as a class project. A retired couple who had never owned a dog in their lives became the network's most reliable emergency fosters, taking dogs overnight when placement fell through at the last minute. The town started seeing itself differently because it was doing something different. At month 14, the city council voted to increase the shelter's annual budget by $62,000, the first budget increase in over a decade. The motion passed unanimously. Council member Diane, who had sat quietly at that first meeting when Carla read the kill numbers aloud, stood up and said something that made it into the local paper. "We were funding a system that didn't reflect our values. We didn't change our values. We finally aligned our budget with them. At month 18, the live release rate hit 71%. The national benchmark for a community shelter operating as no-kill is 90%. They're not there yet, but the trajectory is undeniable. And Freight, he passed his canine good citizen test at month 15. The same dog who had a red tag and a behavioral waiver. Carla started taking him to the library's reading program, where kids who struggle with reading out loud practice by reading to dogs, because dogs do not judge and they do not interrupt. He is, by every measurable and observable standard, a completely different animal than the one the shelter had written off. Though Carla would tell you he isn't different, he's exactly who he always was. He just finally got the conditions he needed to show it. Here's the thing this story keeps coming back to, the thing that matters beyond the statistics and the budget votes and the live release rates. Every broken system has a tolerance threshold, a point at which the friction created by people who refuse to accept the default answer becomes greater than the inertia keeping the system in place. Carla didn't change that shelter by being loud. She changed it by being specific, by converting frustration into information, by showing up with numbers instead of just feelings, and then showing up again, and again, and again. She didn't wait for someone with more credentials or more authority or more time to do it. She just asked one question in a public room, and she brought her dog. If you watched this whole story, you are probably already thinking about the shelter in your area and whether anyone is asking those same uncomfortable questions. Here's what you can actually do. Look up your local shelter's annual statistics. They're almost always public record. See if your area has an active foster network, and if it doesn't, look into what building one actually requires. It is less complicated than most people assume. Share this video with one person you know who loves dogs and feels helpless about the bigger picture. Because the Freight network didn't start with a plan. It started with one person who refused to leave that parking lot without an answer. You do not need a title or a platform to be that person. You just need to ask the question. Thanks for watching. If you loved this video, scan the QR code on the screen right now to subscribe and join the Pawsome Life family. Give your dog a belly rub for us, and we will see you in the next video.